As you see, there are two important terms which we may notice immediately while observing the title of the lecture. This is ethnopolitics and language. They remain the main operation terms for the research analysis, which is going to be represented here. The first above notion is in fact an amalgamation of two other terms. The first one is politics and the second one is ethnicity. The second term, namely ethnicity, is closely and significantly associated with the first one because this is the core of the topic. Ethnopolitics is in fact a new word which I'm going of course to refer to it, and which has an extreme popularity among the social sciences and humanistic sciences representatives. For the purposes for this special lecture presentation, politics should be defined, and as you may notice immediately, my approach to politics here is very strongly linked to the more or less liberal democratic approach, or liberal democratic perception. I'm not going to refer to the politics in its initial definitional stage, while referring, for instance, to the ancient Greece or ancient Rome, because I think it might be quite useless. It's much better to concentrate on some of the new phenomena, some of the new definitions which are right now quite popular within the social sciences sphere. Hence, I concentrate on the definition of Bernard Crick, very famous Western political scientist and sociologist, who has formed this definition. And let me come back to this issue as well. So, this is a sort of activity which makes it possible to reconcile, this is quite core word, the interest of various social groups living in an area subject to one power, by granting them the access to the power proportionally to their importance for survival and well-being of the whole community. As you see, this is definitely, as I said, a liberal democratic approach. As you see, there are some subjective groups, the social groups living in a special area, which are subject to one power and which have been granted to have the access to the power. What is important, proportionally to the importance. If we use the word proportionally, we have in mind definitely the democratic choice by the elections. Any proportions might be the outcome of the elections. And this is quite obvious. On the other hand, and this is an obvious limit, which we have to bear in mind, is the fact that liberal democratic approach, in fact, narrows down the historically verified meaning of the term politics, and omits the fact that the history of mankind has shown very clearly that politics is obviously in the form of war, is also politics. Politics in extenso. And it has been, as you perhaps know, invented and popularized by a very famous Prussian theoretician and also the military man, Count Karl von Clausewitz. His important statement after especially the Napoleonic-Russo War in 1812, yes, after the very famous campaign and the Battle of Borodino and the defeat of Moscow, of Napoleon, has been a very interesting fertile ground for Clausewitz to rethink his own analysis of what is really the war. So his assumption was the war is a continuity of politics. We might say it was absolutely proper expression, because in fact the war is also politics, fortunately or unfortunately. So, what is also very important, what we have to bear in mind is the fact that politics has to be this kind of the social activeness which gives some result. Otherwise, politics is very futile. Politics might be ineffective. Effective politics is something which is important. Hence, if we refer to the efficiency or effectiveness, is better to say, we might come back to the very famous kind of the rule, a kind of the principle which has been elaborated and formulated by a very famous British politician in the middle of the 19th century, Lord Palmerston, who has been for twice British Prime Minister, and who formed the important remark that the politics may have the constant interest, but it may also have a changing allies. This is the rule which, by the way, demonstrates or may explain us to what extent British politics is so effective. If we look at it, let's say from the several hundreds years perspective. As you may notice, Britain is a very specific sort of the country which did represent an interesting approach to politics by changing the allies and reaching the same goals. This is the effectiveness in politics. Unfortunately, I must very frankly and very critically say that in my mind, and this my assumption may be a sort of a provocation against you, or let's say in front of you rather, not against, that the Polish politics, while observed in the last, let's say, 400, 500 years, has been the phenomenon which really manifests a completely different approach to this typical rule formed by Palmerston. In fact, the Polish politics, starting from the late Jagiellonian, our two kings, Sigismundus the Augustus and Sigismundus the Old, in fact, may be an interesting example, but very disastrous one also example, for the politics which did have a pillars much different than in case of the politics in Britain, or made by Britain. Because in Polish case, we were intended to have the same allies and changing the goals, which is completely stupid. If you look at the Polish politics starting from the 16th century, we might say that the Jagiellonian dynasty has decided to utilize most of the Habsburg dynasty as the stable ally, despite the fact, was it correct, was it necessary for the Polish raison d'etre, for instance, or not? And the second, unfortunately, I must admit that this is kind of the provocation. The second power, or second entity with which Poland, or being more precise, Polish and Lithuanian state, might have very stable connections was Vatican. And Vatican, from this viewpoint, was much more effective in the materialization of its policy than the Polish one. Hence, my criticism goes very far. I would say that the fact that the Polish state, one of the largest states in the 16th and even in the beginning of the 17th century, has been so futile in maintaining this position, unfortunately lies squarely within the fact of the badly selected allies, and unfortunately changing the politics, changing the political goals. This is a completely different image of politics while comparing with Britain. As far as the ethnicity is concerned, this is a notion associated with the politics. The very interesting fact has to be taken into consideration. And in fact, with this fact we go back to the early 1960s, because the decolonization processes beginning and also the mobilization of some ethno-national groupings within the, not only Europe of course, but Europe is most interesting for us because we live in Europe, but the mobilization of especially indigenous nations, indigenous groupings, they mark the fact that since the 1960s, ethnicity and afterwards ethnicity mixed with politics has become a vital factor for the changing some important world affairs. In fact, and what we have to also bear in mind is that, and this is the second part of the slide, that in the historical memories of many societies, there occurred a sui generis blanking out of the dramatic events from the Second World War. And this was one of the important reasons to what extent the ethnicity as a word has been not so popular immediately after the war, because ethnicity was very strongly linked to the race, which is, of course, a complete exaggeration. But the fact that after the Second World War, ethno-racial or ethno-racist approach, demonstrated by the Nazis, for instance, has been so dominant. It made a certain basis, or very fertile basis, for the fact that all the discussion after the war about ethnicity has been slightly risky. This is one of the explanations why the ethnicity and ethnicity mixed with politics has started to be so interesting for the audience after the 1960s, not before. In fact, this created an increased interest in ethnicity on the part of the scientific media. This is one important fact to be mentioned, and yielded its analysis from both the European and extra-European comparative perspective. The new phenomenon has appeared, the phenomenon of ethnic mobilization of small, and this adjective I utilize deliberately after Miroslav Hroch, very famous, very eminent contemporary Czech social scientist from the Charles University. All the another expression of this entity is the stateless, in other words, dependent European nations. And the word dependent European nation, or if you use it as a sort of the combination, dependent and small European nation, is an invention of Marek Waldenberg, also a very famous Polish historian and political scientist from Krakow University. In fact, those two adjectives, small and dependent nations, remain a constant and interesting object of the attention of contemporary social scientists and also politicians, because they may cause the problem. This sort of demobilization, it had the form of ethno-regional, or I would rather say as ethno-regionalistic, because regional doesn't have the same meaning as ethno-regionalistic. Movements usually satisfied with obtaining the status of regional or territorial autonomy for the areas where they existed. The fact that, due to various factors, for instance, the crisis of legitimacy of power in many existing states, these movements may demand recognition as independent states as well. Namely, my thesis is, as such, the ethno-regionalistic movements, which is sort of the social political activeness of people pursuing towards the reaching the certain status called as the regional or territorial autonomy, sometimes may be switched or may be changed into the demand of full recognition as an independent state. And this is dangerous because it may demolish the existing delineation of the states within contemporary Europe. So is it to mention Montenegro and Kosovo. Indeed, there are two entities which appeared in the last 7 years as new states, with certain demands, and as the result of the very long-lasting crisis in international relations specific